have to admit that it had been a long time since I'd read the manna story from the book of Exodus, and I was so glad to spend some time returning to it in these past few weeks. Cooking and feeding one's self was, for me, always one of the most important benchmarks of adulthood, achieving independence. And fortunately for me, I love cooking. Not that I'm particularly good at it, I think, but I'm really good at following a recipe. I'm the one who cooks in my household. I plan the meals and I prepare them. Growing up, it was my father who cooked for all of us. Chili, stir-fry, fish chowder, recipes that lived in his mind that I have not really been able to fully recreate. I've gotten really close with the chili. I'm still really far away with the chowder, but that's all right, we'll get there. At the height of lockdown, cooking was a critically important task for me, sliding from work into the evening without too much anxiety and worry about the world at large. Letting myself take time to plan and prepare and cook a meal was an act of kindness for myself as much as it was for my husband, when there were so many reasons for me to just simply sit and read headlines and bite my nails. And I know that I'm not the only one in this regard either. Conversations with some of you, along with many magazine and online articles about the sheer necessity of cooking for yourself when everyone had to stay home. It was like in days gone by. There were recipes being traded, dishes being honed in on, boxes of Kraft macaroni and cheese and Hamburger Helper being pulled from cabinets with a rejoicing, "Oh, thank God, there's one left. I forgot I had to cook tonight." One of the specific things that folks really dived into during this time was bread, baking bread. Yeast was a really difficult thing to find for a while, if you recall. People were splitting their sourdough starters and giving it off to friends. They were dusting off old recipe cards. And there is something therapeutic and calming about baking bread. It takes time, first of all. And not time all at once either. You work at it, and then you leave, and then you return, and you work at it, and then you leave, and you return. A finicky bread can take hours to make, being tended to between Zoom calls and chores, doing its own thing in between because, after all, it is alive, a living thing. A seminary professor of mine once said that bread is the perfect food and metaphor for the Christian story and the Christian people. Bread is a process, it is a dance, a way of getting close to the rhythm of life and death and resurrection that our faith holds as central, yet in our daily lives we tend to put just out of our eyesight, which I think is an okay thing. It's not healthy to perseverate on your mortality every minute of every day. But this is what he meant when he said that. In order to make bread, you first start with grain in the earth. It gathers up water and carbon and sunlight. It makes sugar. It feeds itself and it grows. It lives, just as any of us live. And then you kill it. You go out and you cut it down just after its prime, before it goes to seed. You remove the wheat from the chaff. You grind the wheat into flour. Then, among other ingredients, to it you add warm water and yeast. And suddenly, that which is dead is alive again. The bacteria, the yeast, it awakens, it begins to eat the sugar. You let it rest, grow, eat. You let it live. And you knead it, you shape it, you put it into a pan, and then you put it into an oven, and you kill it again. With heat, the loaf sets, and all of the eating and the growing and the living that you brought to it ceases. That is, until the time comes for you to slice into it, and then with a bit of butter or cheese or jelly or just by its wonderful self, you take that bread into yourself. You eat it. And it lives again. It feeds your cells, which flare into activity and work and life. Each loaf or slice or tear of bread that you eat has lived and died at least 4 times or so before you take that first bite, and then you are the vessel for its next life. Now, the general steps of making bread, they're great for baking a loaf of bread for you and your family for a few days. But what if you needed to make more than that, more than just 1 loaf for a small handful of people? What if you needed a lot more, in fact? For example, let's say you needed enough bread to feed an entire population of people that your empire needed in order to function. Because this was Pharaoh's reality. A human workforce needs food in order to be a workforce. And so a portion of Israel's labor always had to go to producing the food that they needed to function. But what is the math behind that of not cutting into the profit line? What is the metric of exactly how much grain needed to be produced for the Israelite slaves that would not also cut into what the Pharaoh got at the end of it all? Well, we actually happen to know the process by which Egypt found the answer to that question every harvest season. And we know it because Egypt wrote it down for us. They were fastidious note takers. The author Ellen Davis writes that tomb paintings show the Egyptian master driving his chariot out into the field with an attitude of command. He arrives smartly attired in a pleated linen skirt with leggings to protect his soft shins, wearing a wig and necklace, holding a staff and a scepter. Barefoot servants lay out a picnic and even a toilet set so that the master may sit at ease, while the business of surveyors, harvesters, scribes, bureaucrats, accountants go on all around him. The picture that emerges from the tomb paintings conforms in every detail to the basic claim of industrial agriculture of our own time, that food is business. End quote. Food is business. And you shall have just enough food, O Israel, to not impede upon that business. Davis also notes that in the scripture that we read this morning, it says that while in Egypt, Israel sat next to the flesh pots, that is, the kettles of cooked meat. They sat next to the cooked meat and ate not meat, but bread, because bread was cheap and meat was expensive. This is the cultural background that Israel brings to this moment of hunger in the wilderness, a hunger that is so frightening to them that their memory distorts, and there is a brief reminiscing of Egypt and its bread, its dependable bread. And it is why when I read this story newly now, I feel empathy for Israel, when at one time I instead raised an eyebrow, because on the surface, this is the story of a people who have just claimed their generational dream, freedom. They watched God rain frogs from the sky, turn the Nile into blood, guard over them while they slept with a pillar of fire, split a sea down the middle for them to walk across, and then they turn and weeks later say, well, at least in Egypt. God overhears this and acts out of empathy for Israel. Perhaps it is because God realizes that this chosen people, God's chosen people, that they are sick. That they are sick with tyranny. That though they are out of the land of Pharaoh, Pharaoh is still governing in their mind. If at some point, as God has intended, these people are to become a nation together, one centered on the great love and power of Adonai, they have much to learn and much to unlearn. I like to think that God realizes this when God overhears these complainings. And so, God chooses this moment to start their education, their edification, their preparation, a 40-year long curriculum, and it begins with bread. In some basic sense, God steps in and does what Pharaoh did in a material sense, provides bread for the people. And perhaps not even much more than what Pharaoh provided them. The text says that they were given amounts just what each of them needed for every day. What God shows them is that there is another way. For generations, they had been born, they lived, and they died under the impression that there was only one way, Pharaoh's way. And that all tasks and efforts and endeavors supported and existed for the purpose of Pharaoh's way. But God's lesson here is that Pharaoh's bread was merely bread. Harvested grain, flour, loaves, all produced to do a single thing: propel the human body into servitude. And Israel may have had its bread from Pharaoh's hand, but from field to table, it was a sinister system that brought it to them, cruelly indifferent to the misery and suffering it took to make it so. God's bread, manna, is intended to do more than feed the bodies of Israel. It is meant to heal the trauma of their past, the trauma of the tyranny that injured them. Manna is to show them a way of living that does not need to come at the plight of others, a way of living that springs up as an offering for all to share equally. God gives them a vision of what their life together as a nation could be like if they believe that a different way could be so. And after this, how could they ignore it? They were experiencing it firsthand. They were eating manna every day. And someday in the future, when they finally come to settle in a certain land, they could continue this through their own freely given labor. They could show each other the care and comfort that God showed them. This is not Pharaoh's way. But it's not an easy thing to unlearn a scarcity mindset from generations of tyranny. Remember, 40 years of wandering is what it takes. But that does not give God pause. It still begins here, in this moment, with something simultaneously ordinary and critical. With bread from heaven, God teaches the people that their days of servitude are done and gives them permission to leave the misery, the suffering, the anguish, their pain, to leave it behind them in Egypt or somewhere on the ground in the dusty wilderness as they travel together forward into something so much better than the regularity of mere bread. And though, as we know, they will trip up in these 40 years ahead of them, the lesson of manna is not lost on them. What it promises, what it shows, what it heals. For, if you read all of chapter 16, this story ends with Aaron taking an omer of manna, that is, the amount that one person needed to eat in one day, taking an omer of manna, putting it into a jar, and under Moses' instruction, keeping it for all generations as a reminder of how for 40 years they more than merely ate in the wilderness. Now, we are not strangers to encountering the inextricably ordinary and critical. We are about to experience it here in just a moment together. But through it, let us find the new way that God is opening to us. Let us see the vision of a chosen future that God is putting before our eyes. Let us receive the gift of manna and be healed from the injuries of our past, not to ignore them or to distort our memory of them, but to grow stronger in the knowledge that God desires for us to be healed and move forward into a future our future together. Friends, may it be so. Amen.